Yeah, I got it.
Okay. Okay, everybody please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Right hand over your heart. Ready? Begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Everyone remain standing for a moment of silence, please. Thank you. Please have a seat. Okay, we will begin with the invitation to address the Board of Trustees on agendized and non-agendized items. We only have one, Ms. Cynthia Clark.
Good evening, everyone. Well, kind of. I usually only come when more than one person has asked me the question, which quite a few people ask, so that's why I'm here. And my name is Cynthia Clark, and I live here in Paris for 26 years. And it's public comment. Well, duh. I don't like to talk, so that's... since the public needs to fill out a form to speak at public comment or on an item from the agenda, why is their name not included in the minutes any longer? Because you used to include it, and I thought you needed to. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Okay, we have the consent calendar. Do I have a motion?
So moved. Second?
Any questions, comments? No? Okay, please vote. Okay, thank you. And
the certificated personnel action item, Mrs. Ortel, popped up.
I don't know why, because it's under the consent calendar.
Okay. So it's already been approved, isn't that correct? Okay. All right.
introduction of...
Yes. It gives me great pleasure, everyone, to introduce the new principal at Heritage High School, Mr. Frank Arce. Frank? Now, you have the job, but here's a test. You have to do it twice, tonight, and you got to come back on August 19th and do it again, but you have to come to every board meeting anyway. You can come up and give us the shortened version of who you are, and but you have to come up to the microphone to do it. But while you're coming up, I'll remind everybody who don't know, you can go there. We had quite an extensive interview and recruitment process. We went out 2 times, and glad we went out a second time, and we have some of the members of the committee that are here, and the rest of them are going to come on August 19th to welcome you. But Frank wowed 2 interview panels, did a great job, and he's somebody you probably recognize because he was the dean/athletic director for 1 year at Paris High School, got his administrative foot in the door, and left us for Elsinore to be an assistant principal at Lakeside High School, and he had a middle school assistant principal experience there, and he's been at which high school?
Valley View High School.
Valley View. It's okay if you had forgotten it because you don't need to think about Valley View anymore. But he has spent less than a year at Valley View High School, where Dr. Rouse was an assistant principal at one time. So we're all connected. But Frank, it's a pleasure to have you back in the district. To say you have big shoes to fill is an understatement, but we're glad that you'll be at the helm there at Heritage High School.
Well, thank you, and I'm absolutely up to the challenge. Heritage High School. Everyone I talk to and say it's Heritage High School, they say, "Wow, it's an awesome school. It's a great opportunity." This is my 15th year in education, my 6th year in administration, and I'm proud to say I started off in my administrative career here at Paris Union. And let's see, I have a beautiful wife, which is my better half, and I say that to everyone. And I have 4 beautiful kids, and they're all really excited about this opportunity. And I'll do my very best to make you all very proud every single day. So thank you for this opportunity. Thank you. Oh, there's the ringer. That's my time. On the mark. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
You didn't realize you were under a timer, did you?
Good job, Lori.
Yeah, I think it was Dawn who gave him the ding. Okay.
I don't know what happened. That's a glitch in the system. So just go to next item.
Okay, information item, update on activities associated with the district's renewable and sustainable energy. I believe that's being moved for 2 weeks.
Well, what I'd like to ask the board is, Mrs. Twyman couldn't be here this afternoon, and along with Mr. Agundez, this is it's important to the entire board, but it's been expressed to us that it is extremely important to Mr. Agundez and to Mrs. Twyman. So with the board's permission, we'd like to move it to August 19th. Do they have to vote to do that? To move it?
Yes, you do, because it's on there as an action item. Well, it's an info item, so that's okay.
Okay, they don't need to do that. It's an info item. Okay, so with the board's consent, we will move that to August 19th. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Information item 7.2, presentation or review of information concerning issuance of second series of general obligation bonds authorized pursuant to Measure T.
Right. Okay. And before I turn this over to Candace to introduce, I would want to remind the board that we talked to you in June. I remember we didn't have a July board meeting. Thank you, Mr. Agundez. In June, we talked to the board about our issues with Measure T and lack of a state bond and our desire to continue doing the work that needs to be done at Paris High School. So with that, I'll introduce Candace, so we'll frame it from there.
Okay. Yeah, we actually talked, I think it was in May and then at the special board meeting in June. And so we're moving ahead as you gave us the authority to do. Scott Smith, as you all know, is our financial advisor from CSG Advisors. He's here tonight to give a presentation as part of preserving the capacity for Series C that we talked about. It requires that we issue a small amount of capital appreciation bonds, and with that there is legislation that a presentation is made to make sure that the board understands the financing plan. And so Scott will do his very best upon Mrs. Cooley's request in an email earlier to me this week that it's easily understandable. And I think Scott's comment back to me was, well, as easy as the state will allow it. So Scott does a really good job of breaking things down into small little chunks. And so probably about 20, 30 minutes plus, any questions, and then we'll be done. Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
So members of the board, members of the staff, Scott Smith, CSG Advisors. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible, but as was alluded to, the reason for this presentation is because of the bond structure that we're using for the Series B bonds and certain requirements regarding that structure of information, financial disclosure information that needs to be provided under AB 182, and I'm going to explain that in some detail. Just to lead off, and I'm working off of the presentation, a hard copy that you have, and then I'm going over it here. But I'll let you know if I'm on page 2 or page 3. I can slip into jargon at times. I can't, it's very difficult for me at times not to do that. But this is a presentation for you to have a better understanding of what it is that we're doing. So I'd like to keep this as enough informal that you should feel free to ask me questions or tell me to slow down or whatever as we go along. So to lead off, as I like to lead off with certain financings, is what are we concerned with in this particular financing? So first of all, we're looking to generate $40 million to fund completion of Phase 2 of the Campus Master Plan and the PACE project at Paris High School. This is driven primarily by the lack of a state program with matching funds for construction of these items. There's also a smaller component for district-wide security improvements. Second, because of our structure, where we're going to have a small use of capital depreciation bonds, we need to demonstrate that we meet or exceed the requirements under AB 182. Finally, very much this is a multi-year, multi-issuance program under Measure T, and so while we have very important funding needs today, what we are also doing is preserving capacity in how we structure the bonds for future projects under Measure T. So it's very much with that in mind of why we're using a small amount of capital appreciation bonds in this issuance. So the background on AB 182. So back, and you guys will all recall, back in 2013, the state legislature passed 182 because of perceived abuses by districts in the use of general obligation bonds. They were perceived as overburdening taxpayers. And what they specifically meant to do was to place limits on the amount of what they call in the legislation compounding interest bonds, which are done in the form of capital appreciation bonds, and also to create more transparency regarding the financing structures. So what I am required to do as your financial advisor under 182 is to give you an analysis of the total overall cost of the bonds that allow for the compounding interest. I am here to assure you that they are being issued with a 10-year optional redemption feature, that they have a maximum term of less than 25 years, in our case much less than 25 years, and a repayment ratio that does not exceed 4-to-1. Ours is in far lesser proportion than that. And the repayment ratio is the ratio of total debt service to the amount that we're borrowing. So, you have principal, you have interest, the total amount divided by just the amount that you're borrowing.
Scott, if I can interrupt just for a moment, just for the board and for the public, just so you know, this came about as a result of a number of districts, but primarily we all remember Poway Unified borrowing $100 million to do computers, to buy technology in the district, and it ended up costing the taxpayers $1 billion, or 10 times the amount. Is that pretty close to what happened there?
Yeah, theirs was a sort of an extreme example. I think there's more context to the Poway program than that, but essentially they had a borrowing today in which there was not repayment off until many years, past 30 years. And I've got a sort of a slide that provides a little bit of an illustration of this. But imagine if you're borrowing money today and you're not obligated to pay anything, principal or interest, for many, many years. You can imagine that there's a large accrual of interest during the time period in which you will be making those, you'll be paying back who's lending you the money, the bondholders, and then a very short time to repay that principal. So you had Poway borrowing a lot of money today, the payments were way off in the future, past 30 years. I think their bond term was like up to 40 years for that issue, and so you had this huge accrual of interest, and
And that's why the legislature reacted, and
That's right.
we have the legislation, which is, again, the medicine is stronger than what the problem was to fix or the ailment. But now we have very strict guidelines, which you're telling us we're comporting with.
So,
That's right.
so excuse me. So Scott, do we know what it's going to be yet? It says not to exceed 4-to-1. So
Yeah, I'm going to go through in
so we have an
painstaking
idea of
detail.
what it's going to be.
Yes.
That's why we're getting here for 3 minutes.
Like
So these are the
like
things
2-to-1.
These are the things that I am obligated to present to you. The second bullet is a comparison of the overall cost of issuing the bonds if we had just done them as current interest bonds, not as using any compounding interest bonds. The reason why we're using compounding interest bonds. And then finally, there's a disclosure form that's provided by the underwriter that Candace has already signed, and that I need to just make sure that you guys are aware that it's been received and signed by the district and what it says. So here we go. All your questions answered. First, I thought it would probably be appropriate to say, what are SIBs and CABs? So current interest bonds, which we'll refer to as SIBs, are bonds that pay interest to investors on a semi-annual basis until their maturity. So the illustration that I gave is sort of a very basic, vanilla debt service profile. So we borrowed $20 million. We have relatively level, there's some growing debt service in this example, but average debt service is about $1.5 million a year. You can see in the early years, you're just like with your home mortgage, you're paying mostly interest in the early years, a little bit of principal, and then as time goes on, you're paying mostly principal and a little bit of interest. The second example, which is an extreme example for illustration purposes, it's almost like the Poway example. In this example, we're borrowing $20 million, and these are using capital appreciation bonds, CABs. And what CABs are is they're bonds that defer the payment of interest to investors until the maturity of those bonds by compounding the interest semi-annually at a specified rate. So you can see in the second example, there's no payments in years 1 through 20, and there's just payments in the last 5 years, and that's payments of principal plus the compounding interest. So you can look at, these aren't done to the same scale. So you can see in the first example, we have average annual debt service of about $1.5 million. In the second example, that average debt service in the years where we have to pay debt service, those last 5 years, is like $13 million. And that's that compounding interest feature. So, in this example, obviously a lot of interest accrues over 20 years, and then we have a short period, only 4 years, in which we're paying back the $20 million that we borrowed in year 0. Any questions there? Okay, so to explain a little bit about our structure, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of growth in the district. So you can see here, this is our growth in historical assessed valuation going back to 1987, so going back 30 years. And you can see that during that time, we've had fairly dramatic growth, especially going from 87 up to the end of the boom period, which was 2007. Not so dramatic of a change over the last 10 years, only about a 2% growth rate. However, what you can see during that time is that we've basically gained back most of the AV that we lost post-crash of the Great Recession. Some of that's driven by a modest amount of new growth, and a lot of it is also with real estate repositioning itself, and with the assessor now. This is happening in my home where I live. Where they're starting to claw back some of that assessed value that they were taking away as the the post recession years, what a lot of the assessors did with your AV. So assessed value. Why we care about assessed valuation is that with our borrowing, remember what we are trying to do is based on what we believe AV will grow to during the term of the bonds, that we need to not exceed $30 per $100,000 of assessed valuation. And so we look at the past as one guide, but we've also done our own studies of what's happening in the area, what are the economic factors driving growth in our area, and what we've come up with for our program for this bond issue is this growth projection, which is to look over the next, 10 years, and we're looking at closer to about 7% growth, and thereafter a very modest 4% per year growth. And this results in if you take that full period and calculate what the average annual compound growth rate over that period would be, it's about almost 5%, 4.88%, compared with our 30-year historical average compound growth rate of about 8.31%.
Scott, where do these projections come from?
So these are projections that we worked on that I think were discussed a little bit in either your May or June meeting, and Candace, you can maybe explain it. But what we did was we looked with a demographer at all of the projects that are in the books for this area, and what are the economic drivers for growth in this area. And what the demographer provided us was a model that showed that at least for the time period that he studied, which he felt he could only effectively project out about 10 years, and what he found was that conservatively that a 7% growth rate was an appropriate growth rate for our area. And we felt that going beyond that and projecting out didn't make sense. So for the rest of the period, we felt like a more modest assumption about growth was something closer to 4%. Keep in mind that you almost get 2% growth with no new development at all, because you've got your growth in AV from what the assessor does to your annual growth under Prop 13, the 2% escalator that's pretty close to 2% on a historical basis. So you think about an extra 2% on that is a very modest additional growth rate.
And I think the only thing that I would add to our work with the demographer is, and Scott mentioned this, that a very conservative projection, because as we talked about in May and June, we want to make sure that the AV projections we are using are conservative, because if it doesn't, if we used higher AV, just to generate the bonds that we needed to, which districts have done, and it's not a financially prudent way to go, then years down the road, a couple of things could happen, or both things could happen. You wouldn't have the ability to issue the next series when you had planned, or worst case scenario, or in addition to, your tax rates per $100,000 could grow higher. So I think the key point is to look at our projections are this 4.88% over the period of the bond program, whereas the past 30 years was 8.31, and I think that illustrates the point of us being conservative in this program.
Okay, I'm going to move to the next slide. So this is the slide. There's a lot of information here, and so I'm going to try to walk through it somewhat slowly. So this is not only a description of what our bond structure looks like and costs on an annual basis, and what component of it consists of capital appreciation bonds, but it's also to demonstrate the relative cost difference if we were doing just doing current interest bonds. So there's a lot of information I'm trying to present here, and so I'm going to take you through it as slowly as I can. So the first debt service set that's to the left is the proposed structure that includes both current interest bonds and capital appreciation bonds. And here we've got an issuance of about $40.5 million. 37 million of that are current interest bonds, and there's a very modest $3.7 million, which are the capital appreciation bonds. And if you look in the second column, you see those are the annual principal payments on the capital appreciation bonds, roughly between years 2032 and 2040. So it's a very small part of our program, but we're required, because we're doing $1 of them, to go through this presentation. And to the right is a scenario where we have just, if we were doing the same issuance for roughly to cover the same costs purely as current interest bonds. The difference off to the far right is the debt service difference. So you can see in the early years, we have lower debt service with our proposed structure, and then in the later years, we have slightly higher debt service for a total difference of, on a PV basis, this is a present value today dollar basis, is a much lower number, but on a future dollar value basis is $1.7 million. So what is the cost of this to us? Well, our interest rate on our bonds under the CAB structure is about 4.35%. The all cabs interest rate would be about 4.29%. Very small difference. All SIBs, I'm sorry. The repayment ratio under our proposed structure is 2.12 times. That is, far less than the 4.0 limit under the law. The all SIBs approach, it's 2.08. So we're talking about very small differences here. Why is this so important to us then, that we've got such a small amount of cabs? So the next line down in this projected scenario statistics, I've buried the lead on this slide, but the lead is this. Using this small amount of cabs, assuming our growth projections that we've used, we have the capacity when we issue our next series of bonds to issue $63 million of bonds. Using the all SIBs approach, that capacity drops to $43 million, $42.79 million. That's the lead of this slide. It has a huge impact because we have an inflection point around 2021 where we would sort of blow through our projections. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is a lot of this financing program is driven by the growth projections we use in AV. So it's possible that we could see a huge amount of growth in the next, from now and through the next 10 years, and we'll issue more bonds sooner. But what we're trying to do is be conservative to make sure if growth doesn't happen the way we project, but we still have the needs that we believe that we have, that we're going to preserve capacity to issue bonds to meet those needs. So we're trying to do a balancing act and using our Measure T dollars as efficiently as we can, not imposing too much extra cost on ourselves, but not handcuffing ourselves to what we might need in additional facilities if these modest growth projections end up being the reality. So the reason for the issuance of CABs, which this is part of 182, which is this bottom part, is that it ensures greater financing capacity that's projected to be needed in a prospective Series C to meet using our assumed AV growth projections while complying with the state tax rate, the statutory tax rate maximum of $30 per 100,000. So that's the reason. Does that Make sense? I know that was a lot of information, so if you have questions, I would understand. In what sense?
I mean, I'm supposed to vote for 30 years ahead, which that's horrible. I mean, well,
Voting for
yeah,
30 years
well,
ahead no matter what.
Oh, I know, but it just, yeah.
That's right.
But, well,
What are your concerns?
no,
Is it time to get 'em out?
I know. I'm going along with you slowly.
Well, we're not approving it. We're
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
it's information.
Yeah.
I don't know if it helps Mrs. Cooley, but the two tables here at the bottom, I
Right.
think, are the key to what Scott is saying. And when he's when he's showing basically what Scott is trying to explain to all of us is the difference in using a very small portion of cabs versus using only current interest bonds. Doesn't change the overall debt ratio by very much, 2.08 to 2.12.
These numbers are,
I know it's a lot of numbers, but I think one of the things he said, a couple of the things he said were really key. We're trying to do very careful balancing here so that we don't handcuff ourselves for down the road and we can't issue bonds.
And I would say too, Mrs. Cooley, that the difference is like $20 million between the two ways of doing it. That extra $20 million gets us to do more work at today's prices, which are going to be lower than they'd be in the future at Paris High School. In other words, we want to do that ag facility. We've got to do the cab approach in order to do that. And again, as he told you, there's very little risk. We're being conservative. But if we go the other way, then we don't have as much money to do the work we need to do there. Was that okay, Fred and Candace, or was I off on that?
Just the $20 million differences for the next series, but it certainly, if we don't save that amount, it would certainly impact what we could issue today. Did you want to say something, Fred?
And Trustee Cooley, I feel your pain, but I think there's one really important part to this whole thing, and it's when we had the demographer look at projects in the area. The thing that I liked is he actually did the study for Eastern Municipal Water District so that they could figure out which new water lines, which new sewer lines they needed and when. So what we're really trying to do is to generate as much money as we can right now to take advantage of competitive bid prices, but respect the commitments we've made to other parts of the district and have as much ability to sell bonds at a time that is consistent with when the kids are coming. So we're studying this from all different fronts to make sure that we're not overextending.
yeah. But then when we have the two schools encroaching, Murrieta and up here at,
Valverde.
yeah, how is that going to affect the building and the growth? And
It just is. I mean, I'm
Just,
not talking
yeah.
badly about either district, but I think it's unfortunate that both Valverde and Murrieta Valley chose to put high schools right on the edge of
Yeah.
another district's borders. But the reality is that they have Vista Murrieta High School that is at the very northern end of their boundary, southern end of our boundary. Very popular school, but it's there. The new high school in Valverde, it's under construction. It's going to happen. But I think it's the idea of why it was so important to continue the improvements at Paris High School, to continue to make it both programmatically and facility-wise competitive.
And quite honestly, I was hearing from the principal, Don Williamson, from Paloma Valley, and he's got almost 3,100 kids in the computer this year. And we were at 3,300 at Paloma when Heritage opened, and they went down to 2,300. So I think what we're going to see is not only are these estimates very conservative, I think they're going to get beaten by, I think we're going to have a lot more generated tax revenue because there are going to be a lot more new homes because of affordability. And the reason that Murrieta will see less is because it's more expensive to build there. Property's more expensive. And so I think this is a very conservative view, and I think that over the next 5 years, we'll exceed this by a lot. But again, I appreciate the conservative approach so that we have the ability someday to build a new middle school and someday build a new high school.
Well, and that's the point. I mean, it's not just Scott's presentation tonight. It's not just the demographer's study. It's that you have chosen to aggressively move forward with the middle school and the high school planning so that when the stars are able to be aligned, we're ready to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a state facilities program.
You know, and one other way the two schools on our borders could potentially impact the overall facilities program, if and when the state program comes back, and you know, if it looks something like it is now, if our facilities and therefore our programs cannot compete with those neighboring schools, we will lose students and therefore eligibility to apply for those dollars.
And regardless of that, the kids in Paris deserve no better and no worse than Jonathan has said this oftentimes, right?
Yes.
Than the kids in our newer schools. You know, so.
Yeah, what we're doing at Paris High School, we need to do not just because of the competition with Valverde, because it's the right thing to do. And it's embarrassing at Paris High School that we have wires going over the top of building from one building to another in 2015. And so anything we can do, Mrs. Cooley, without breaking the bank and, you know, stopping our ability to move forward on future projects, we need to do. And you've been a strong advocate that you feel that, and you're right, that we have the sixth largest ag enrolled program in the country at Paris High School in a facility that doesn't meet what we need. And so we want to do that, and we think by doing it, we do both things. We make Paris comparable to Paloma and to Heritage and any other high school, Vista or anybody else, but we also we make it more attractive for kids who live on the north side of the district to decide, gee, I can sneak out and go to Valverde, or should I stay here home at not only a great school, but a great looking and high functioning school. So that's what we're up against, Mrs. Cooley, but I certainly appreciate your perspective.
And I think just to beat a dead horse, I mean, there's a trade-off no matter what approach you take. You could borrow less today. You don't have money for the projects, right, that you want to fund. You can not use cab, this modest amount of cabs. What does that do? At a modest cost, it has a huge impact on what your capacity is in the next 5 to 7 years, if growth projections are as we project. So you may be compromising that capacity for your next series. The other alternative is you just, you don't. I mean, I think those are probably the two most likely alternative approaches. The third approach is you do this: you do a modest amount of cabs, and you try and create this balancing act. Mm-hmm. Either way, you've got some kind of thing that you end up with that you're like, might make you feel a little uncomfortable. We think this is probably the thing that should make you the least uncomfortable, depending on what you've said your priorities are to us.
And we've made a commitment since I got here 8.5 years ago to make Paris facilities comparable to Menifee facilities. We've made that very clear. All the Measure T money that we've spent so far, except for planning those two schools, has been at Pinacati Middle School. And Pinacati Middle School is going from worst to first. The worst, least functioning middle school campus in the county to the best. And Paris deserves that. And they deserve it at Paris High School as well. And I know there's a little bit of a risk, but the risk also is for us to keep walking over to Paris High School and saying, we have great teachers and we have great programs, but our facilities don't let the kids have a 21st century education. And I don't want to do that, and I know none of you want to continue doing that. So we are where we're at.
Okay. Scott, I just want to confirm my understanding in case I need to explain this. So the ratio from 2.12 to 2.08, the difference is 0.04. That is going to cost $1.7 million in order to increase the capacity from 40 to 60.
That's exactly it.
Okay. Now, but my question is, what are the implications for the constituents in terms of money paid? I, as a homeowner, am I going to pay more? Or?
I've got a slide for that.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Got a math teacher on the board.
I mean, I think that I'll get to it. I don't have it that precisely addresses that question, but I'll have exactly what the amount is, and I can't do the math that quickly in my head, but I can give you what the math is shortly after by email to Candace. It's going to be like minuscule.
Thank you.
So I'm going to take one break from 182. I know that the board cares a lot about transaction costs. What are you paying people like me? So this isn't a requirement of 182, but here is a description of all of the costs that people are getting paid. At least they're not to exceed amounts, so they may bill less than this. But here's just roughly the cost. The biggest numbers are for underwriting and for bond insurance. We'll not select a bond insurer until we have our rating. We do that at the very end. This is a high side estimate for bond insurance at 30 basis points of total debt service. 30 basis points is a fancy way of saying 0.003% of a percent. And then the underwriting fee is just a maximum amount that'll be in your bond resolution. Their fees, which have not been negotiated yet, will be probably significantly less than this estimate. So roughly about $200,000 for the financing participants. That's less than half of 1% of the whole issuance cost. And unless there's any questions on this, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to partly get to your question with this slide. Again, a lot of information here, and I'm going to try to walk through it and answer any questions as we go. So it's going from left to right. So the big numbers, which I didn't label, I apologize for that, is our assessed valuation. And so at the growth rates that we described in the slide, here is this is a projection out of that assessed value going out over 30 years. And then going to the right on your page, we issued $35 million of Series A bonds. That's the actual debt service for those bonds. The next column is the projection of debt service on a gross basis for this series of bonds. I mean, on a net basis, this is what the taxpayers will actually pay. The column after that is the summation of those two columns. If you look at the estimated tax rate for assuming those two issues based on our growth projection, that dollar amount per 100,000 is about $26 to $25 per 100,000 through roughly about 2022, and then it drops to about $15, $16 thereafter, and then trails off even lower than that after the Series A bonds go away. And so in this scenario, we layer in our Series C, where we're trying to project out this need for future capacity. And this is just to let to say what the number would be if we were to fill up the whole $30 per $100,000 bucket. And you're probably looking at this and saying, well, that number doesn't go to $30, Scott. What's going on here? We do make certain adjustments that the county makes to the roll when they enroll your tax. They add a reserve fund. They don't include utility revenue, so we have to throw out the Inland Empire Energy Center. Gets thrown out altogether. The assessed value of that property is only $300 million, so they get thrown out. So there's a built-in cushion here that the county provides that we're factoring in this doesn't factor it in, so you can see that we're slightly below the $30, which is great.
But the bottom line is it's still less than $30
That's
or
right.
at $30 per 100,000, which is the promise we made to the voters.
Right. And so, I think the question you asked, which is, okay, I see this 25 to 26, this 15 to 16 in the later years. How does that change? What that tax levy would be if we did the all SIBS approach? And all you do is change the debt service you see in the total column by those debt service differences, and you can see it's like a blip. It's like pennies difference. I think it'll probably be a very small change, and I can calculate it for you and show you, but it's going to be very small. Yeah, exactly. Because we're talking about multi-billions of assessed value. So, any questions on this? Just for another way of looking at this, I've also showed the debt service graphically. So you see the red line is the $30 per $100,000 limit over this time period, and the blue are the Series A bonds. The red is our projected Series B debt service, and the very light blue is our projected Series C. Just to say one other thing about Series C, this shows it coming in 2021. We don't know when Series C will be issued. That's purely going to be a function over, the next 4 or 5 years, how AV grows differently than what we project. So if AV grows significantly higher than what we've projected, those bonds will I'm sure, get issued sooner, because you think about it, you have more AV, you got more kids, right? So you'll need facilities sooner. So our crystal ball is our revenue, is our AV projection, and that's what we're working off of, and that's how we're basing our program. But reality will be something different than that. Okay. Next slide. Just this is the G17 letter. It's weird that it's in the legislation, but this is a letter that, in the day and age of current municipal bonds, every issue has a G17 letter, not just school districts. Everybody who issues bonds has to sign a G17 letter. This designates Stifel as the underwriter. Partly this was done so that underwriters could be clear to define that their role is not as a municipal advisor and not as a fiduciary to you. What's a fiduciary? That means that I'm a fiduciary to you. And what does that mean? That means I put your financial interests above mine. So that's what a fiduciary is. Stifel, as an underwriter, has a duty of fair dealing. They have an obligation to purchase the bonds at a fair and reasonable price. But the letter also states their financial interests are not the same as your financial interests. They're the balance between the buyer and seller of the bonds. So this describes that role. It also describes the financial considerations regarding the issuance of capital appreciation bonds. It's much the same as the stuff that we're talking about here. And they do it as a safety thing to say, this is required if you're doing complex municipal securities. Some people think that capital appreciation bonds are complex municipal securities, so they have a description in the letter about the use of capital appreciation bonds. This letter is available for you to review. I just took a little snapshot of it and added it here, but that's all. Unless there's more questions about it, it's pretty straightforward. Finally, our schedule. The state is also, through 182, required a longer schedule. We tried to break this up because we know you have a lot of business to cover during the 19th, but the actual approval of the issuance of the bonds, it has to be presented at 2 consecutive meetings. We needed to come here tonight to have the next action item approved, so we thought this was a good opportunity to at least get this out of the way with a lighter agenda. So we have a bit of a prolonged process because of that agenda item, but we'll be bringing the first reading of the issuance resolution on the 19th. We'll bring the approval on the 16th. The county has to approve our issuance. That'll happen either on the 29th or the 6th. We're not sure yet. And that'll drive when we price and close the bonds, which will probably be in mid-October and closing in late October, early November. And that's it.
For the administrators in the audience, tomorrow's professional development. There'll be a special extra session at the end. Scott will be there, and there will be a quiz. And if you don't pass the quiz, no, I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Okay, action item on buildings and grounds, adoption of resolution number 2-15 to 16, providing for the levy and collection of taxes to pay debt service on the district's 2012 election Series B bonds. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Thank you. And we have somebody to speak on this one as well. Go ahead and introduce it, and then we'll have someone wants to speak.
I thought I was the somebody we were referring to.
I have somebody from the audience who would like
Okay.
to speak on this thing.
Oh, okay,
Okay.
great. So just real briefly, Scott alluded to this, but this is the resolution that the board is required to adopt. The reason for our special board meeting tonight, this has to be to the county by August 10th, so that the county can levy these Series B taxes in 15-16. Certainly they could have started in 16-17, but the very major downfall to that is it lowers our capacity for Series C, potentially, or at least by some amount, but it could negatively impact that. So we thought it would be best to get it on the 15-16 tax roll.
Okay, thank you, Candace. Any questions on this?
No.
No comments?
It's just scary voting, or thinking 2048. Where are we? I guess I know where I'll be.
What do you think they were voting on in 2012? I'm just wondering.
That's what I think when they let me refinance my house.
Yeah, you're talking about 30 years no matter what. So, okay, then please vote. Okay, thank you. And before we move to adjournment,
Thank you, Mr. President. In my haste to introduce the new principal at Heritage High School, board members, I forgot to introduce to you the interim principal that we brought in so that we can get Heritage High going, and that's Mr. Steve Haney. Steve, could you stand up and so the all. Steve Haney is responsible for Steve Swartz. He was his principal when Steve was a teacher in Temecula Valley, but Steve is an experienced principal in Lake Elsinore and Temecula. And Steve, we really appreciate you coming in and pinch hitting for us and doing a great job there. And I know you're going to slowly hand the baton over to Frank, but thank you very much for your help.
okay. Motion for adjournment?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, please vote. All right, our meeting is done at 4:55. We are adjourned.
I'm going to have to go and study this.
Well, it's very well. We're spending an extra $1.7 million over the long run. Get $20 million more borrowing.
Take your brown envelope. Sorry, those are invitations
Okay.
Just wanted to make sure you got it. Sorry to interrupt.
So that's essentially what